Marilyn Dorsey stood frozen, her face pale as she read the bold words staked at the forest's edge. Access strictly prohibited to all Oak Hollow Estates residents. Calvin Reese didn't flinch as she turned to him, trembling with disbelief. "You bought the entire forest?" He took a slow sip of coffee and nodded. "That's right, Marilyn. The land you tried to control now belongs to me." It all began on a foggy November morning, the kind that settles into your bones and makes the pines drip like they're whispering secrets. Calvin Reese had just rolled his old Silverado into the garage, a fresh buck strapped neatly to the game cart and back, when he first heard the unmistakable whine of a golf cart engine tearing up the silence. He sighed already, knowing who it was before the cart even rounded the bend. Marilyn Dorsey, 63, fiercely opinionated and newly elected president of the Oak Hollow Estates Homeowners Association. She'd taken her title as seriously as a Supreme Court appointment, strutting through the neighborhood like she was queen of her own little fiefdom. Before her rise to power, the HOA had been more of a suggestion than a governing body mostly concerned with seasonal wreaths and lawn height. But Marilyn came in like a wrecking ball of bylaws and brightly laminated complaint forms. Calvin had lived quietly at the edge of Oak Hollow for nearly 8 years, keeping to himself, respecting everyone's space, and most importantly, respecting the land. His property backed up to the Longleaf Timber Reserve, a stretch of privately owned forest so large it didn't seem to end. It was the reason he'd bought the house in the first place. For men like Calvin, who found solace in early mornings among the trees, who believed in the sacred rhythm of the woods, the call of hunting wasn't sport, it was stewardship. Every tag, every license, every step into those woods was earned and lawful. But Marilyn didn't see it that way. Not even close. The golf cart skidded to a gravel-crunching halt at the edge of his driveway. Calvin didn't need to turn around to know she'd brought her clipboard. He could practically hear the smugness in her posture. "Mr. Reese," she barked, hopping out like a drill sergeant with a schedule to keep. "Can we have a word?" Calvin set his cooler down gently beside the garage bench and turned, wiping his hands on a rag. "Morning, Marilyn," he said evenly. "Busy day." Her lips were already pursed, her eyes locked onto the cased rifle leaning against the garage wall. "I noticed some activity this morning. Shots in the woods. And now?" This sheet gestured toward the cart as if the neatly wrapped cooler inside it was radioactive. Hunting. Calvin nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Legal, ethical, and well outside HOA property. I was nearly 2 miles into Longleaf. Filled my tag right at sunrise." She sniffed, clutching the clipboard like a Bible. "The community rules strictly prohibit any behavior that disrupts the peace or endangers others. Bringing firearms and carcasses through the neighborhood violates the spirit, if not the letter, of those rules." Calvin felt his jaw tighten. He didn't raise his voice. "Never had to." "Nothing I'm doing is illegal, Marilyn. You can check my licenses." The buck was taken legally, far from any homes, processed respectfully, and brought back discreetly. "This is my property. The HOA doesn't extend into the woods." Her expression soured like spoiled milk. "It's about appearances, Mr. Reese. Optics. There are children here. What if they saw that? Then maybe they'd learn something about responsibility." "About nature," he replied flatly. "Instead of pretending meat comes shrink-wrapped from aisle 7, she gasped, offended. "Consider this an official warning. We will be documenting this incident and discussing it at the next board meeting." With that, she spun on her heel, climbed back into the golf cart, and sped away, a cloud of judgment trailing behind her. That was the spark, the beginning. Calvin had seen it coming the day she was elected. She'd smiled too wide, spoke too long about upholding standards and preserving our image. He hadn't thought she'd make it personal. But now it was clear she wasn't just anti-hunting. She was anti-Calvin. Maybe it was the truck, or the boots, or the quiet confidence of a man who didn't seek permission to live on his own land. Over the next few weeks, the warnings became fines. First, $100 for disturbance to the aesthetic enjoyment of the community, then another for improper handling of biological materials. Calvin read the notices with the same grim patience he used to field dress a deer. He filed them, highlighted their vagueness, and penned polite but firm rebuttals, none of which were acknowledged. Soon he noticed Ken Wallace, Maryland's right-hand man, and a retired insurance adjuster with too much time on his hands, sitting at the end of the block with a newspaper he never turned the page on. Marilyn's golf cart passed his house at least 3 times every weekend. She once stopped to photograph the outline of his boot prints in the frost. It was getting absurd. The message was clear: Calvin was being watched, judged, targeted. Not for anything illegal, but for disrupting the HOA's illusion of suburban harmony, because he dared to live his life in accordance with the law, not their whims. Still, he didn't stop hunting. He couldn't. The forest was more than a place, it was a sanctuary. When he entered those woods, the hum of HOA pettiness faded beneath the rustle of leaves and the stillness of dawn. But every return trip home felt like stepping into enemy territory. He began unloading his gear late at night, backing the truck into the garage before turning off the engine, moving like a fugitive on his own land. Even then, the letters kept coming. Fines accumulated, now totaling nearly $1,000. The last one hinted at placing a lien on his property. That was the moment something shifted in Calvin. A cold, stubborn anger settled in his chest. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was an attempt to control, to bully. And they'd picked the wrong man for that. He didn't raise hell. He didn't scream or start petitions. He did what he'd always done. He studied, he prepared, he planned. If the HOA wanted to draw a line, Calvin Reese was ready to show them exactly where that line ended. Because somewhere between the first fine and that lien threat, Calvin had started wondering who owned the forest, and more importantly, what would it take to buy it? That night, long after the neighborhood lights dimmed and Marilyn's golf cart had made its final lap, Calvin sat alone at his kitchen table with a glass of bourbon and a stack of legal papers. The fine notices were spread across the wood like a deck of cursed cards, each one more absurd than the last, each stamped with the cold, embossed seal of the Oak Hollow Estates Homeowners Association. His eyes lingered on the last one. A formal notice of intent to place a lien on his home for unpaid HOA penalties, totaling $1,125.67. The charges were laughable, unauthorized display of game equipment, transport of offensive materials, community disruption due to recreational weaponry. But the implications weren't. This wasn't just petty harassment anymore. This was financial warfare. And for what? For legally harvesting a deer 2 miles deep into a forest the HOA didn't own, couldn't control, and barely understood. Calvin took a slow sip and leaned back in his chair. Enough was enough. He wasn't going to let a bitter HOA president with a clipboard and an inflated ego dismantle his life or his rights. He'd already gone through the bylaws, highlighted every section, combed through the CCRs. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, that gave the HOA any say over activity on land they didn't own. Especially not thousands of acres of private forest owned by someone else. But something about that fact kept rattling around in Calvin's head. That phrase, owned by someone else. The Longleaf Timber Reserve. For years, it had just been the woods to him. A place to hunt, to think, to breathe. He knew the ridges the deer runs, the water pockets, better than most people knew their own garages. But who actually owned it? He'd never looked into it beyond what the original property disclosure had said, adjacent to privately held timberland. That night, curiosity turned into a mission. He opened his laptop and started digging through the county tax assessor's database, combing through parcel records, property maps, and ownership registries. It didn't take long. The entire tract, nearly 6,000 acres, was listed under Longleaf Timber Reserve, a trust entity established in the 1970s. Mailing address, Raleigh, North Carolina. The trustee, a name he didn't recognize, Elliot M. Carr. An elderly-sounding title if he'd ever heard one. Calvin narrowed his eyes, rubbing the back of his neck, as a strange idea began to form, fragile and ridiculous at first. But with each click, each document, each trail of digital breadcrumbs, it started to solidify. What if he could buy it, not a slice, not a buffer strip, the whole damn thing? The more he thought about it, the more sense it made. The trust had held the land for decades, never developed, it never subdivided it. He'd heard whispers that developers had tried and failed to make inroads in the past. If it was still being held as timberland, maybe the family was looking to offload it. Maybe they were tired of paying the taxes on it. Maybe they'd prefer selling it to someone who would keep it wild rather than carve it up into subdivisions. He needed help. Someone with money. Someone with brains. And someone who, above all, wouldn't ask too many questions. That someone was Raymond Lee. Ray was a former college roommate, now a tech entrepreneur, semi-retired at 48, living in Denver with more money than he knew what to do with. But more importantly, Ray was an outdoorsman at heart, a fisherman, a conservationist, and a man who once upon a time had shared a tent with Calvin in freezing Appalachian backwoods and swore he'd do anything to stop suburban sprawl. Calvin called him the next morning. "Ray," he said, not even bothering with pleasantries. "You ever wanted to own a forest?" There was a pause, then laughter. "What did you do, Calvin?" "Not what I did," Calvin said. "What I'm about to do." He told him everything. The HOA, the harassment, the fines, the threat of a lien, and the forest that sat just beyond the property line, sprawling quiet and potentially up for sale. Ray didn't laugh again. By the end of the conversation, he was all in. "You're telling me we could actually buy the whole thing," Ray said. "Thousands of acres, preserve it, keep them out." "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Calvin replied. "Not just to get back at them, but to protect it. For us. For the land." "Hell," Ray said, "I'll wire money tomorrow. Let's form an LLC." Within a week, Red Ridge Holdings LLC was born. Calvin handled the Landside County Records title, research environmental restrictions. Ray handled the money and legal team. They kept everything silent. No whispers in Oak Hollow. No emails from their home addresses. Every move was cloaked. Calvin hired a surveyor under the guise of property clarification. He wanted hard lines. No disputes. The new survey cost nearly $3,000, but it was worth every cent. It confirmed what he already knew: his property ended exactly where the forest began. HOA jurisdiction stopped at his fence line. The forest. That was something else entirely. Calvin also had the surveyor take a few extra steps, literally. He asked about the track behind Oak Hollow. The surveyor raised an eyebrow. "That whole stretch, every acre," Calvin said. Meanwhile, Ray's legal team made contact with Elliot Carr, the trustee of Longleaf Timber Reserve. Carr, now in his late 70s, responded through a cautious email. The land was potentially for sale. Developers had been sniffing around for years, but the family wasn't interested in turning it into concrete. Calvin and Ray's offer, complete purchase, full stewardship, no plans for subdivision, was exactly the kind of legacy deal Carr had hoped for. They met over Zoom. Carr was skeptical at first, but once he saw how serious Calvin was, once he heard him talk about game movement, soil erosion, habitat protection, he softened. "You actually know this land," Carr had said. "Not just the paperwork. You know it." "I've walked every inch of it," Calvin replied, "and I want to protect it." Over the next 2 months, everything moved quietly but swiftly. Timber valuation assessments, environmental impact reviews, financing paperwork. Carr wasn't giving it away, but he wasn't gouging either. Calvin sold an old rental property to get his share. Ray liquidated some stock. Together, they scraped together the down payment and secured financing for the rest. On the final closing call, Carr chuckled. "You boys just bought more land than most counties out west." "We're not building on it," Ray said. "We're protecting it." Carr's voice was warm. "Then I've made the right decision." 2 weeks later, the deal closed. Red Ridge Holdings LLC became the legal owner of 5,842 acres of forest land directly bordering Oak Hollow Estates. Calvin stood on his back deck the night the papers were signed, staring out into the dark wall of trees. Not someone else's woods. Not a borrowed wilderness. His. Marilyn Dorsey and her army of lawn rule zealots had tried to shame him into silence. Instead, they'd pushed him into buying the very thing they feared. And they had no idea what was coming. Not yet. The morning after the closing, Calvin stood at the edge of his property, boots planted in damp pine needles, surveying the silent stretch of forest that now belonged to him. Not figuratively, legally. He ran his hand along the spine of a fresh aluminum sign resting against his thigh. It was bold, simple, and impossible to misinterpret: private property. No trespassing access. Strictly prohibited to all Oak Hollow Estates residents. Below it, in smaller print, violators will be prosecuted. Property of Red Ridge Holdings, LLC. The wind picked up, tossing the edges of his flannel jacket as he nodded to Ray, who was hammering a post into the ground just behind the tree line. They'd already placed 6 signs along the main trail entrances, the ones worn down by years of neighborhood foot traffic. The paths children played on, couples walked their dogs on, where teenagers sneaked out to smoke, and retirees wandered with coffee cups and binoculars. Not anymore. That era had ended the moment the ink dried on the deed. This wasn't some HOA buffer zone. This was a privately held conservation tract, and the people who once took it for granted were about to be formally introduced to the concept of boundaries. They spent the better part of that Saturday mapping the perimeter planting signs every 100 feet along the Oak Hollow, side particularly near fence gaps, makeshift footpaths, and informal access points, where residents had long treated the forest as their extended backyard. By dusk, the message was impossible to ignore. Calvin knew it would cause an uproar. That was the point. The HOA had pushed him into a corner, and in response, he'd bought the walls. Now he was sealing the exits. The fireworks began less than 48 hours later. At precisely 8 or 12 a.m. on Monday, Marilyn Dorsey came striding out of the woods behind Lot 117, jaw-clenched clipboard in hand, and an expression of outraged disbelief frozen on her face. Calvin was sipping coffee on his back porch, half hoping he'd catch her in the act, and right on cue, there she was, charging across 3 yards in flat shoes, her pearls bouncing with each furious step. She didn't even stop at his fence line. She planted herself just short of his steps, finger jabbing toward the tree line, where a new sign gleamed in the morning sun. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded. "These signs, this language is completely inappropriate. Community members have been using those trails for years." Calvin didn't flinch. "Not anymore," he said calmly. "That land isn't yours, and it's not common space. As of last Friday, it's owned by Redridge Holdings. Ray and I are partners. We own every acre you've been trying to tell me how to use." Her face turned a blotchy red. "You what?" "We bought the Longleaf Timber Reserve," he said, pulling a neatly folded copy of the deed from his back pocket and holding it out like a royal proclamation. "All 5,800 acres of it." She stared at the page like it had personally insulted her. "You can't just fence off nature. That land has been part of this community's experience for decades." "That land has never been yours," Calvin corrected. "You just assumed it was. The previous owners were permissive. We are not," she sputtered, flustered. "I'll take this up with the county." "Go ahead," he said, nodding. "And when you do, they'll show you the same property lines I confirmed during our survey. No easements, no rights of access, nothing. Your HOA has no jurisdiction there. Zero." "This is retaliation," she barked, "because we enforce the rules. This," Calvin replied coldly, "is the consequence of overreach. You wanted control so badly you pushed someone who values their rights. And now I own the very woods you tried to weaponize." Marilyn stood frozen, her eyes darting between the deed and the trees. For once, her words failed her. She turned abruptly and stormed off, crossing 3 more properties on the way back, likely racking up her own internal list of bylaw violations. Calvin smiled into his coffee. By Tuesday afternoon, the Oak Hollow message board was in chaos. Screenshots of the signs spread like wildfire. Some residents were confused, others were furious. But most were just blindsided. For years, they'd treated the forest as a public amenity. Now it was private and policed. Calvin and Ray wasted no time reinforcing that fact. They installed high-resolution, motion-triggered trail cameras at the most trafficked access points, each configured to send instant alerts to their phones. The cameras didn't lie. Within the first 48 hours, they caught 7 trespassers. A few were teens. One was a jogger with earbuds. 2 more were retirees with Nordic walking sticks. Calvin didn't escalate yet. For the first wave, he printed still-circled faces and mailed copies directly to the HOA board with a formal cease-and-desist letter from Redridge Holdings' attorney. The letter outlined the new ownership, emphasized the revoked permission to access the land, and warned that continued violations would result in legal action. The language was dry, but the point was sharp. Predictably, not everyone listened. Saturday afternoon brought the next escalation. A trail camera pinged Calvin's phone, showing 6 figures walking side by side into the forest from the old dog-walking entrance near Sycamore Lane. Leading the pack, Marilyn Dorsey, clipboard in hand. Calvin zoomed in on the photo and shook his head. "She's really doing this," he muttered. "She's staging a protest walk." Ray, sitting across from him on the porch with a tablet and a beer, looked up. "Time for law enforcement." "Yep," Calvin said, dialing the county sheriff's non-emergency number. "She wants a showdown. Let's have one." 15 minutes later, a deputy in khaki uniform pulled up in a dusty SUV. Calvin met him at the trailhead, showed him the deed, the sign, the footage, and the cease and desist letter. The deputy raised an eyebrow. "You weren't kidding?" "No, sir." Calvin crossed his arms. "I want them off my property." The deputy nodded, radioed his partner, and walked into the woods. 15 minutes after that, the protest march returned, less proud, more panicked. Marilyn was arguing with the deputy, her voice shrill and cracked. Gary, the HOA treasurer, was red-faced and silent. Two of the walkers peeled off early and headed home without saying a word. The deputy issued them each a formal trespassing warning and explained that next time they'd be facing citations. Marilyn tried to claim historical access rights. The deputy shut her down with one phrase: "No easement, no entry." She didn't speak to Calvin as she passed, but the way she looked at him like he'd robbed her of something she believed was hers told him everything. That night, Calvin and Ray celebrated with a quiet drink in the woods just inside their newly marked line. No more surveillance, no more fines, just trees, stillness, ownership. The fallout came fast. By Monday, the HOA's internal message board was boiling over. Parents were angry that their kids couldn't explore. Dog owners complained about losing their favorite paths. Birdwatchers lamented the blocked access. And in every thread, one name kept surfacing: Marilyn Dorsey. Why had she pushed so hard? Why had she gone after Calvin? Why hadn't she left well enough alone? At that week's HOA meeting, held in the clubhouse with extra chairs pulled from storage, the mood was mutinous. Residents confronted her. Gary sat silently beside her, avoiding eye contact. Marilyn tried to defend her actions, calling Calvin combative and uncooperative. But it was no use. The board splintered. Her support evaporated. One by one, residents began speaking up, not just about the woods, but about the fines, the citations, the petty warnings. Marilyn's rulebook had become her noose. The following week, she quietly resigned for health reasons. Ken Wallace didn't attend the meeting. No replacement was named. The board went quiet. The golf cart patrols ended. And Calvin, he kept hunting. He walked the trails in peace, not as a trespasser, but as an owner. The forest stretched wide and free before him, every tree a reminder of what patience, principle, and quiet resistance could achieve. What began as a campaign of harassment had become a declaration of freedom. And the HOA, it never found him again. In a world increasingly driven by rules, restrictions, and overreach disguised as community standards, this story reminds us that there is power, real power, in standing up for what is right, legal, and fair. Calvin Reese didn't set out to make a statement. He simply wanted peace, freedom, and the ability to enjoy the land as a law-abiding citizen. But when confronted with unjust pressure, intimidation, and petty misuse of power by a homeowners association, he chose to respond not with anger, but with strategy, persistence, and ultimately ownership. The core lesson here is this: know your rights, stand your ground, and never let someone bully you into submission when you're acting within the law. Whether it's a neighbor who oversteps or an HOA that forgets its limits, accountability matters. Calvin didn't retaliate out of vengeance. He responded with resolve, backed by facts, legal counsel, and a quiet belief in personal freedom. His actions demonstrate the importance of patience over panic, documentation over argument, and preparation over confrontation. Another important takeaway is the value of relationships and integrity. Calvin's old friendship with Ray, founded on trust and shared values, became the key to something much larger than either of them expected. It's a reminder that the right partnerships built on mutual respect can turn obstacles into opportunities. To our viewers, especially homeowners and property stewards across America, let Calvin's story serve as a powerful reminder: don't give up your ground. Don't let bureaucracy or neighborhood politics dictate your way of life when the law's on your side. Educate yourself. Keep records. Speak softly but carry a big deed. And to those in positions of authority, whether in HOAs, communities, or elsewhere, remember, control doesn't equal respect. True leadership listens, cooperates, and honors boundaries, not just physical ones, but legal and ethical ones as well. From all of us here at US Daily Story, thank you for listening and standing with us as we share real-life tales of justice, perseverance, and quiet triumph. If this story moved you or made you reflect, we invite you to like, comment, and share your thoughts. Every voice matters. And remember, sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't louder, it's smarter. See you in the next story.